good evening from Singapore, good afternoon, and good morning to wherever you are in the world. My name is Lauren Sorkin, and I am the Acting Executive Director of the Global Resilient Cities Network. I'm pleased to welcome you to our 25th speaker series, Cities on the Front Line. Tonight, we're going to be discussing whether urban density will matter in the context of COVID-19 response and recovery. Before we get started, I would like to remind everyone of the purpose of these sessions. These are knowledge sharing sessions for experts and practitioners in cities and those who are supporting cities. And so we ask that you do not publish anything that you hear on the series tonight without the explicit consent of the presenters. If you are on the line from the media and you do want to share these presentations onwards, please do reach out to us and we will facilitate a connection to the speakers for their consent. I also want to remind everyone of the ground rules for tonight's session. We will be using the Q&A function, which you can find on the bottom of your screen to pose questions. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce my co-host for the session, Francis Gasquer from the World Bank.
Thank you, Lauren. So on behalf of the World Bank City Resilience Program, welcome everyone. As Lauren mentioned briefly, we have a slightly different format for today's session. We are experimenting, seeing whether we can move towards a much more active discussion style. And so we will try more of a panel discussion. We have three speakers who are joining us today, three experts in urban density. We'll have Dr. Wiwandari Handayani, who's an associate professor of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Diponegoro University in Semarang, Indonesia. We will then have Jagan Shah, senior infrastructure specialist with DFID-India, and he was formerly director at the National Institute of Urban Affairs. And finally, Judy Baker, who's a lead economist and a global lead at the World Bank looking at resilience and land. We have prepared a couple of leading questions to get the conversation started, but we will then take questions from the Q&A section and we will distribute them among the speakers and try to lead the conversation. So I'll encourage you to ask your question in the Q&A section of the WebEx. And before you ask, yes, the material and recording of this talk will be made available online. Without further ado, let me turn now to Amit, who will be moderating jointly with me the discussion and will provide a short introduction on today's topic.
Thank you, Francis. Hello, everybody. We've got an interesting panel today. I think the discussion around density, we've been hearing some chatter in the news lately around density being an issue when it comes to the spread of the virus. So we thought, let's look at it a little bit more closely. If you look at the evidence, you find that a large number of cases are in some of the largest cities around the world. Look at Mumbai, look at London, look at New York. And even within cities, you find that cases are concentrated in some areas more than others. There was a survey recently done in Mumbai, which found that more than 50% of the population in 3 slums had actually been exposed to the virus, whereas areas just outside the slum, that proportion was significantly lower. If you look at the case of Singapore as well, you find that there's been a spread of the virus in the dense worker housing, but not so much in the community beyond the housing. So these examples seem to indicate that density could be a problem, since proximity of people may allow the virus to spread more quickly. The popular media has been also raising this issue. The Straits Times in Singapore had the title, "Is Density Doomed?" This was in their May 14th issue. CNN posed a question, after the pandemic passes, will people choose to leave big city behind? And the article actually went on to say that Governor Cuomo blames density for the spread of the virus in New York, where it's about number of people in a small geographic location allowing that virus to spread. As urban planners, we have been advocating for urban density in our planning work for a long time. Should that change in a post-COVID world? What would we like to hear from the panel? So that's really what we would like to hear from the panels. What are their thoughts on this particular issue around density and the virus? So with that, I'll move to Dr. Wiwandari for the first question. Dr. Wiwandari, let me start with you. You come from a research background and are based in Semarang, Indonesia. What are you observing in Semarang and Indonesia related to this particular issue? Are you finding that the spread of the virus is more pronounced in cities and denser neighborhoods? Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss about density. Before I start, my name is quite complicated, so feel free if you want to call me just Wiwi. Yeah. Before trying to explore more your questions, I would like to give a brief fact about the COVID-19 cases in Indonesia in the perspective of density. Yeah. So when we talk about Indonesia, you need to understand that we are consist of a lot of islands, and 70% of the total population, 70% of the total population in Indonesia live only in Java Island, while the island is only like less than 7% of the total area of Indonesia. So before we jump into at the city level, maybe at the nation level, we need to be aware that Java Island itself is already very dense. And when we talk about Indonesian, we need to also consider the Java Island and outside the Java when we talk about cities, densities, urbanization. I will briefly show the cases in several selected big cities. There's Jakarta, of course, and then Bandung, Semarang, Surabaya, located in Java, but also there's some cities outside the Java. Briefly speaking, I just want to mention that you can see the numbers there, and whether it is characterized at red or orange zone, depending on the confirmed cases. You can check the numbers of the population density. But the message in a very brief introductory part here, I would just want to give an attention on the position of the mega urban and metropolitan, especially that those are located in Java Island. Those with more than 10 million, 1 million population, it shows that the cases is very much concentrated on this area, but not only in the main city, but also in the peri-urban area. So when we talk about cities, we cannot just think the main city, but also the surrounding peri-urban area, because the peri-urban area also likely to have a similar risk level to its main city. And we cannot blame the density itself because of this fact, as there's like a high connectivity and mobility among this very rapid growth of the metropolitan area. Next slide, please. A brief overview about the case in Semarang. As you can see, the pattern that's not very clear. It can happen in any village or urban village across the city. Like I show some illustration for Semarang. So density is almost evenly spread all part of the city. So the cases could be moved from one village or urban village to another one. But then we need again to show or to put more awareness on not only the density itself, but also how the interaction, the mobility among this area. And of course, in the end of the day, I think, again, the individual responsibility, people awareness is very important. Next slide, please. I just want to show you in the next slide how the dense kampung area in Semarang, showing that because of the closeness between buildings and house, and it gives more opportunity for people interact more closely. But I think we cannot blame the density itself, but of course we need also to consider again the interaction and the mobility, because most of the area have a good accessibility. Yeah, I think I would stop here to address your first question, Amit, and I hope we can further elaborate in the next discussion. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Bui. I think that's you started to articulate certain other factors that have been contributing. If I heard you correctly, density is not the only issue, and as you pointed out, in Java Island, we're talking about urban and peri-urban, and the cases are kind of similarly spread in the context of Java Island. And the other issues you started to talk about was the issue of connectivity and mobility. So you've already started to articulate other factors that may be contributing to the issue of the spread of the virus in urban areas. Yeah. So we'll come back to you. I think I wanted to move to Jagan. Jagan, you're coming from an urban planning practitioner background and also coming from a planning history background. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, this is not the first time we're discussing the link between density, urban planning, and public health. Could you share your thoughts on this link? And why have urban planners been pushing for high density living? What have been the advantages we've been talking about? Over to you, Jagan.
Thanks, Amit. I'm just going to start straight away with a few images that I put together. I think the whole question about the impacts of COVID and the interpretations of how density and public health are interrelated has, in the Indian context, unfortunately got caught up in also the problem with the patterns of urbanization and the ways in which our cities have developed. And I think that's something that we need to acknowledge. We don't as yet have the full evidence base right now, apart from epidemiology data, to begin to look at how cities and the COVID impacts have actually got mapped together. So I will be trying to highlight in my presentation some of the key issues which I think are going to matter as we go forward, looking at density in the context of Indian cities, in the context of improved quality of life and safety for citizens from pandemics and other threats. I think to whom does urban density matter is a very important question. It's not just whether or not it matters, but to whom does it matter more. And if I can just ask you to take a look at the top left image, that's a dense agglomeration of residences, 2,300 BC. That's a Harappan site, the plan of Mohenjo-daro. The image just below that is describing what Ed Glaser and Ava Joshi Ghani have been arguing, which is that density of human interaction really brings out the economic life and the economic productivity that fuels a lot of the urbanization. And the image just before that is sort of the global example of how Glaser and Ghani's argument comes together, which is the city of New York. If you look at Manhattan, that dense agglomeration of economic activities is what makes it so successful. But if you look at the larger image on the screen, this is a divided city. This is New Delhi on the upper side, the old historical core, on the lower side, the modern city. Now, the problem is that the modern city is not afforded to everybody. And therefore, the inequalities which are there in society begin to reflect themselves in the way that the political economy responds to the whole question of density, which currently is being viewed as sort of like the paramount risk as such in urban living. Now, the problem is that this combines with a certain pattern of urbanization, which is messy and hidden. If you look at the image at the bottom right, which is zooming in onto nightlight data that the World Bank put together in 2016 to really describe the patterns of urbanization, which are about peri-urbanization, which are about conspicuous consumption of land and resources. And this begins to crop up as an issue, because what you realize is that if you look at the map on the left side with the purple colors, those are the districts of India. And if you look at the darker colors, those represent the amount of built space that has been constructed in these districts, and it far exceeds by factors up to 3.5 the actual growth of population. So there is a speculative urbanization going on in the country, which puts at risk the populations that are most vulnerable and that are forced to work and live in very dense neighborhoods. And these are the working class. These are people working in the micro and small enterprises and doing home-based work, and especially women doing home-based work. So there's a lot of risk that is treated there. And my third image really is what I call the master plan as the fetish, because what has historically developed in the Indian context is a discipline of planning which has made plans for controlling land use, but has not been able to control land use by the instrument of planning. And therefore, I'd like to actually close my reflections by saying, well, that map that you see, the largest image that you see, is showing the sprawl, the urban sprawl in the National Capital Region around the city of Delhi, where I've been very involved in the planning exercises, both at the regional level as well as the urban level. And where we realize that, in a sense, there's a fait accompli, there is a lock-in that is created by contemporary, existing, and historic patterns of urbanization, and you cannot unlock from that. And locked in, therefore, are inequalities and unequal access to space. So for city managers, this becomes important because they must look at the society, the economy, the environment, and the governance of their cities with relation to density, because density is in a sense almost a proxy for the way people live. And so this then plays into our understanding of value, our understanding of what should be priorities in planning. And I just want to end with two quick thoughts. We are working, for instance, in India, we're working on an initiative that really looks at building back better from those dense neighborhoods. We cannot abandon the density. I think, Amit, you said in the beginning that it's really about overcrowding, perhaps. And you know, I think that overcrowding of the built habitat of India, mainly because there's speculative development on the one side, and then you know, the poor and the working class forced into this. This needs to be seen now in a new perspective, where we have information and communication technology that allows us to manage density better. So if we can build back better by building capacity in communities that can manage their own environment as well, monitor it, for instance. We also develop, you know, the capacity for a decentralized management of risk and a decentralized and participative system that actually manages public health systems. I'll pause there, Amit, and I'd like to maybe come back later. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jagan. I'm going to step in. Thank you for those very useful insights. I think Ibu Winnie drew our attention on the difference between density and interaction, which I think is a very interesting concept. And I think if I follow you, you really also draw attention to the difference between formal and informality in the development of our cities. Let me turn to Judy. Judy, you've worked a lot in informal settlement, and in fact, you're really one of the top experts at the World Bank in this topic. What are your views on the impact of informal settlement on density, on how COVID was managed? What are the insights you've been able to extract from your recent analysis?
Thank you, Francis, and to Judy and Jagan also, because I think you made some points that are very consistent with some of the thinking. So we know that the urban poor living in informal settlements face many challenges and are at particular risk to the contagion of illness, and in this case, it's COVID. And a lot of this has to do with the conditions, and it makes social distancing very, very difficult. And so you have overcrowding within slums or informal settlements, but then also within households. And that's exacerbated by other challenges such as limited access to basic services, a reliance on crowded and awful informal transport services, so cramming into tuk-tuks and other kinds of services, transport services that makes it very crowded. You've got poor quality of housing, a lack of secure tenure, and most urban poor work in the informal sector, so they don't have social safety nets to fall back on, so the impacts of COVID can be exacerbated. And then there's a number of things about working in the informal sector where you're, again, not able to socially distance. So the hypothesis, and I think what we are seeing in many places, is that, in fact, it's in informal settlements where the population is at high risk. So it's not just the issue of density, but it's some of these other factors as well. That being said, I will acknowledge that we don't have a lot of accurate data on what's happening in slums and the spread of COVID. So I think in Dharavi, we've had a lot of news reports coming out at the beginning that were saying, no, it's looking good. They've managed to contain the spread. But lately, in some of the reports that I've seen, it seems, in fact, that things maybe aren't looking as good as we thought. Maybe after Jagan can reflect on that. I am currently working a lot in Africa, where we see the numbers are also very unclear about what's actually happening. There's a sense that the demographics are in favor of some of the people living in slums in Africa because it's a lot of youth, where the illness seems not to be as hard impacting. But again, I think we don't know. So going to the question of density, the next slide, please. I think density really needs to be qualified. So when we think about density, again, as was just mentioned, this can be a really good thing for cities. The agglomeration or the concentration of people and services can bring efficiencies. It can lower the cost of shipping. It can lower carbon emissions, which is important for sustainability. So all of these things really can be beneficial. So density per se is good for cities. But I want to throw out this concept of good versus bad density, and I suppose it would be useful to come up with a better term because I don't think it's so black and white. But this has come up, everywhere I've worked. So when you think about the good density, so we heard about New York and Singapore, of course, and places like Hong Kong, it comes with proper urban planning and management and urban design that ensures that the density is well located, it's coordinated with the location of jobs, services, and public transport, and the design of cities and density so that you can produce a walkable and livable environment. So, if you think about this in the terms of COVID, think about a place like Singapore. It's a very dense city, put on the left, but they've been able to manage the contagion of COVID quite well. Then we flip to this notion of bad density, and that really comes in the absence of this good urban planning and management. So in highly dense and concentrated cities that have not been well planned, you'll enter into things like congestion, residential areas are not linked with jobs, public transport may not be available. It can result in shortages of affordable housing, leading many to end up squatting and ultimately end up living in informal settlements. So that's the photo on the right. That one's from the Philippines, but I think in many parts of the developing world, many cities have crowded slums that have this lack of services. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. I think you're totally right. We can certainly separate between good and bad density. At the end, sometimes wonder if it just doesn't come back to government capacity and resource availability. It'd be interesting to see what's the cause and what's the effect. But let me turn to Ibu. We again, and Ibu, you work in cities that have very limited capacity in urban planning, and still, what would you advise, what do you suggest to these cities as they start focusing on intervention to try to address a future where pandemics are probably going to be more prevalent?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Yeah, when we talk and define density, actually, there are always like a positive perspective and also maybe the negative perspective of that. In the perspective of the urban growth management, we are likely to promote density because it will create efficiency, and also like already mentioned before, it's also related to the effort to reduce emissions. And in the perspective of the local government capacity, of course, the manageable density will also help the government to maintain the public infrastructure provision, and of course controlling in the end to be able also to control the sprawl phenomena. The COVID will, the pandemic then will force the government to have more attention, to have a more balanced city size distribution, because in most, I think it happens across the world, mostly in Indonesia or mostly in Asia, there like a big gap between big size cities and small cities. So some cities is very big, but maybe some is very small. So maybe the pandemic will have a more reason for the government to create somehow policy that able to provide a better balanced distribution of the city size. And for the government capacity, like let's say most of the developing cities experience that to a certain extent or to a certain level, we need density to maintain efficiency in providing services and creating a livable environment. And to do that, I think one important highlight is how to involve wider stakeholders, not only depend on the government initiative, but also non-government by developing partnership to create innovative solution in combination with a proper policy and regulation. I think that will be like the challenging, but also hopefully the pandemic will create more innovative ideas to have a better solution in the sense that, yeah, maintaining the density. And of course, like I've mentioned before, also maintaining and creating a more balanced interaction and mobility among area. Yes, so I think I will stop here at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Wiwi. I think you touched upon something interesting, which is all of us are facing the pandemic, right? It's a universal challenge suddenly, and it's not one part that's suffering more. It's in everybody's consciousness. And is that going to give us that opportunity to rethink how are we doing planning? I mean, I think while density is part of the discussion, I think how we are doing planning is also important. Both Jagan and Judy articulated that there are certain aspects of density that are, the bad density is partly because of lack of good planning. You see Singapore, where it's got excellent planning, they manage density incredibly well. They've able to come up with a great livable city. Other places are not able to manage. And Jagan, you said that, it's like you're not able to manage through master plans, etc. So, is this opportunity where the pandemic is being experienced by everyone going to provide the opportunity for innovation in tools, technology, etc.? So, just a reflection on what you were saying. I think coming to Jagan, I think as cities start to look beyond the virus, what are some of the lessons that one could learn to help with building back better? What should be the approach now? And maybe this touches about this innovation as well, but what should be the approach to promote density? Because clearly density by itself is not bad. I think, part of what we're hearing now, and also if you start to read more deeply in the literature, density, even the research that has happened so far, very early research, but it's showing that density has advantages. You've had better quality of services in urban centers that has allowed people, not to be, the mortality rates is lower because there's better services in dense areas. So, we don't want to give up this notion of promoting density. So what would be your recommendations in a country like India, which is really rapidly urbanizing? What would you recommend to the, to the commissioners, to the city leaders? So back over to you for your thoughts, Jagan. Thanks.
Thanks, Amit. I think that's a great question. I think if you have to build back better, we have to recognize that we have a history, right? So we have a long urban history. Most of our urban centers are historical urban centers. And it's through the process of accretion that these urban centers have now become what they are today. And today they capture the country's imagination. It is the economic powerhouse, so to speak, of the country, now with a more balanced regional development also in villages and districts. So if you look at this scenario, really one of the key lessons that we've learned is that a lot of the response has to be localized and decentralized. So under the Disaster Management Act, the Indian government basically empowered district administrations, not necessarily city administrations in the same way. So, the geography of managing public health and the geography of managing cities, these have to be reconciled. And the only way that they begin to get reconciled is through what I believe as being one of the most promising innovations, which is e-governance. E-governance is not a trivial thing. It is associated with decision support systems. It's associated with real-time data capture. It is associated with a far more evidence-based decision-making activity, which is what we need. So when I said that we can manage densities, so in fact, in the chat bar, somebody's asked the question, can we use ICT technologies to make density a good density? I think absolutely. I don't think there is a bad or good density. Density exists, but that's because cities exist. And there can be a variation of densities, but density is almost embedded into the very idea of the city. But I think in order for us to build back better, look at a green recovery in the future, to really do a better job of our cities, this is a great trigger moment because we've learned that decentralized management works. We've learned that communities are ultimately the front line of response, and this is something that we understand across the whole, the discourse around resilience. So resilience is fundamentally decentralized, localized, as much as possible, empowered to be, almost independent. And if you now build into that our focus on renewable energy, off-grid infrastructure, the ability to improve the basic general standards of everybody's life, that overcrowding has to be mitigated. And that can only be mitigated if more public land is made available for low-cost housing. So there is an entire policy environment that needs to get built up around managing density to ensure public health, but managing density without losing the economic significance of density or the economic outputs created by those densities. Now, I was reading Melvin Weber, who wrote about the non-place urban realm. I mean, that's an idea that comes from 60 years ago, but it's still very current. It is possible today for us to build communities remotely. It is possible for us to build enterprises and businesses remotely as well. But in that context, the city per se and urban density per se cannot be treated as something that is tradable in some sense, except through an evolutionary process of redeveloping so that we provide basic standards of access to open space, access to green space, basic services and so on to everybody. And that exercise is what I think can be enabled greatly through these applications of geospatial technology, communication technology, used to decentralize even decision making with regard to how to manage density.
Great. Jagan, great reflection on the role of technology. And I think one thing we didn't touch upon, and maybe something to come back to, is all of us are now able to work from remote locations. And one of the reasons cities existed was this opportunity for creative economies, which was, we could all be next to each other and meet each other and spur the creative economies. And suddenly we're all realizing that I can be sitting in the beach somewhere, or I can be sitting in the middle of, anywhere I want to be, frankly. As long as I'm connected, I'm contributing and participating. Is that going to put some pressure on, and maybe you can take this for another minute, and Judy, then I'll ask you the next question. Is that going to be putting some pressure on cities to, support decentralization? Maybe take a minute on that, and then Judy, to you.
Sure, Amit. I think we shouldn't jump to that conclusion yet. Especially in countries like India, we're not yet at that moment where we can make that leap of faith towards the future of work as being a completely electronically enabled and so on. The digital divide is still very real in India. But however, the desire to make that jump is really strong. So we can leverage that. Certainly, but I don't think that I would say that density doesn't matter because now we can work from distances, because we still have corporeal realities. Ultimately, Amit, you and I still need to get our hair groomed, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? So society still exists, and economies exist, and services exist, and they exist in space. So I think we can make that kind of leap only if we completely neglect the fact that our cities are divided cities or unequal cities. If inclusion and inclusive growth trajectory is our imperative, then I don't think we can jump to that yet. We still need to take sort of a bottom billion, so to speak, of the world's population to a point where they can be part of it. Right?
Great, thanks, Jagan. Great reflection there. Judy, economic geographers have been promoting the benefits of agglomeration economies that are offered by urbanization. I think we've touched upon a few of those points right now. Do you think that'll shift due to the pandemic? And I think Jagan may have already started us down this path, but is there more to add here, which essentially points to no, we're not moving away from that approach of agglomeration economies? And then as you're dealing directly with national governments globally, what is your advice, or what is going to be your advice to policymakers, particularly when it comes to living, urban living and informality as we start to move out of COVID? Thanks.
Amit. So I don't think the benefits of agglomeration will disappear with the pandemic or any other kind of shock. I think that they're, from an economic perspective, from a spatial perspective, they're here to stay. And it really comes back to what we talked about before, this notion of good urban planning and management and good governance. Making cities livable, inclusive, sustainable is hugely important to reducing risks for people. And that includes a range of risks. So it's pandemics, but it's also natural hazards and economic shocks. So what I would say to policymakers, within cities, I think, well, and across cities as well, but it goes back to the question of inclusion. So investing in improving living conditions, especially for the urban poor who tend to be the hardest hit during these kinds of shocks, is hugely important. And it is something to have to say that in many countries, it's not politically popular, it's difficult to do. And so we're just not seeing the kind of investments at a scale that is required to reach the almost 1 billion people living in slums across the developing world. So I'll come back to some of the work that we do at the World Bank. We support urban upgrading programs that invest in physical infrastructure. They connect people to other parts of the city through transport and microfinance to improve their homes. We have programs in all over the world. So some of the biggest ones are in Indonesia, of course, where we have a national program that we work with in Kenya, but also some in Vietnam, also smaller places, Djibouti, Mozambique has a large and growing program, Argentina. So we're working all over the world. And there we work also with NGOs and local governments, so it's not just national governments. There are a lot of good examples and good evidence about the impacts on living conditions, on risk reduction, improved health outcomes, and better opportunities for livelihoods and home-based work. So these investments, they help create a safe environment and reduce risk over time. We saw that in places like Ebola, and I think in some places now. There are some lessons when you think about doing such upgrading. Like I said at the beginning, it's very complicated and messy. So, some of the takeaways are making sure that you link with local governments and city planning and infrastructure. So again, this, I think, links very carefully to the notions that we talked about with good density. So making sure you have that link. Having flexible and functional standards for infrastructure upgrading, making sure that communities are at the heart of whatever you do, both in terms of the design as well as the follow-on and the maintenance, keeping people in place, in situ upgrading when possible. So it's very difficult to move people. So when you can upgrade in situ, it's very important. I also just want to take another half a minute to talk about some of the innovations that we've seen coming out of informal settlements and point you to a resource. I'll send it in the chat box. So we've been doing this weekly PowerPoint of things that are happening in cities and slums around the world. Just examples, but homegrown solutions, local governments engaging, and what to address COVID. And I think there's a lot of innovation happening. We see things like, setting up hand washing stations in slums where people don't have access to clean water, using innovative apps for contact tracing, using hotels to house the homeless population or the sick, for quarantining people. So there's a range of interesting and innovative solutions that are coming out of cities, which goes back to my original point about the importance of this agglomeration and density, because I think it does help to incentivize innovation and efficiency, and can be very impactful over time for the growth of cities and the economy. So thank you.
Thank you, Judy. If I can keep you for one more minute.
Sure.
There, you talked about all the good work that the bank and many other funders are doing in slum upgrading and trying to formalize informal settlement, to bring infrastructure, to bring services. You haven't touched on a critical issue, and it's a question from Jane Katz, which is asking, can you address the issue of land tenure and the high cost of land, which of course is one of the principal reasons why we end up with slum and people having to move to informal settlement?
Yeah, no, thank you. So this, of course, is the biggest challenge in cities. So some of what we're seeing, first of all, again, from many years of experience, is that this notion of land tenure regularization is not, there's not a perfect solution. So we have to, it's again, going back to, the color analogy is not black or white, but that we see a lot of solutions that are in between. So when we do upgrading, we can't always immediately formalize and give people, a piece of paper that ensures them tenure security for the rest of their lives and for generations to come. But what we see in what is working in many places is some kind of gradual process. So you start with some kind of formalization that is, again, maybe not on one extreme, but it gives a little bit of security to people. And then over time, you can work into the city planning guidelines how to make these areas more secure over time. The other point on sort of finding land to do upgrading is a continual challenge. And so then it means that there's always this trade-off about being close to the city center and in the dense areas versus being a little bit on the outskirts where land is cheaper and more available. The one thing I would say is that we've moved away from the bank used to be involved with what we call sites and services projects where we do greenfield development. This, I think, holds a lot of promise for rapidly growing cities where, you still need to find places to house people. But the key there is to make sure that these areas are linked to jobs, that there's access to affordable and efficient transport, and that there are services. So again, some of the mistakes that were made in the past in some of these communities, I think, you can find examples like in Mexico where they built a lot of housing that was, quite affordable for people, but nobody wanted to live there because it was far away from the jobs and there were no schools. So I think it's a combination of different approaches, especially in a land-constrained environment, which is the case in most cities. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. Jagan, did you want to pick that question up in the context of the Delhi master plan? Like, how are you trying to think about the, formalizing informality, or what are you trying to do with the slums? I know you've been engaged with the master plan recently, and maybe it's worth having some reflections from you.
Amit, I think the important thing about the informal sector is that people within the informal sector don't particularly shun the idea of formality, of formalizing things like benefits or security or health insurance or such like things, which any worker would enjoy, even if it's a small enterprise. So I think in terms of the informal sector, the way we need to address it is that it's part of the economy, a key part of the economy, and space needs to be created for allowing the informal sector to remain small, even if it formalizes in terms of its business processes, that it can remain small. So there are a number of initiatives that we find very exciting in that respect. Working with one of the state governments in India to look at a wage employment initiative in the city, which brings slum dweller associations into the picture of managing petty labor contracts and such like, and providing the services of labor contractors to the cities. There's those kinds of initiatives which we find exciting because they allow you to really look at formalization as an ongoing process of transition rather than one of a definite break. But in the Delhi master plan, certainly the focus is on looking at the commons as being a very important part of the overall plan. The informal sector uses the commons more efficiently than, so to speak, the formal sector. So the use of a small neighborhood park in a low-income neighborhood might be much higher than an entire square kilometer of park which you and I might use to take a morning walk. So there is the need for us to address the fact that concomitant with the informal sector are also other networks and other access constraints and such like, which we need to take care of. But the most basic requirement is that the informal sector should have the same access to services, to a secure place to actually operate their economic activity, and they should have access to safe housing. That would be the high priority in the master plan.
Thank you, Jagan. Ibu, I was wondering whether you wanted to build a little bit on these ideas. What's the role of the informal sector in moving the city forward, in creating a more of a livable environment where density is an issue and it's difficult for government to really have effective interventions?
Sector indeed really like the greatest challenge in most big cities, and as long as there are more economic activities, it will attract more people also to, again, in migration will also becomes another concern when we talk about informal sector, because most of them who do this activity is not necessarily the people who live there, but also from the surrounding areas. So I think we cannot only focus on, I would like to bring this into the wider context, because we have been or put a lot of concern on how to think about the informal sectors within the city, but also it is also important how to control the growth of this informal by trying to spread the economic activity to other areas to create more balanced economic activity in different growth pools across the country. So we slowly, gradually, by thinking in this perspective, I believe in the end of the day, with a more balanced spatial distribution among cities, then at the same time, we can also control the growth of the informal sector. So I just want to put this into in a wider context to see not only focus on the city, but also how to control this growth by putting more attention on new economic activity in a more balanced way in different cities. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Wiwi. So I've got an interesting question, and I'll throw it open and see if either of you wants to take it, which is really saying that if you're not able to reduce densities, and I think this comment is reflected to the bad density, how do we reduce pandemics in the future? This relationship between that you started off. Does one of you want to take it? Maybe Judy, do you want to take this? And Jagan, maybe you can come to it.
Sure. I'm sorry, I blanked out for a minute. The connection was bad for just 1 second. Can you repeat it?
Sure. So it's saying, if you're not able to reduce density and overcrowding and bad density, how do you actually control the spread of the pandemic?
Yeah. Okay. I think that's, that is the question, right? So I live in the U.S. and I think we manage density pretty well, but maybe not. I mean, we're not very dense here, but we still haven't been able to manage the pandemic. So look, I mean, a lot of it comes back to, having strong capacity in government, both at the national and local level, clear policies, having access to basic services, having access to information, having access to healthcare. And then, I've been very struck here and across the world at how it really seems like every place is handling this pandemic differently. There's some of the differences are small. We know a few things about social distancing and about masks. And about washing your hands that seem to make an impact. But beyond that, I mean, I'm forever struck at the decisions about schools and about public services and about what's acceptable and what's not. So I think, again, sticking to some of the basics and, trying to make sure that you have strong capacity in government to be able to implement whatever policies the scientists say will make a difference. I think that will help in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Judy. Jagan, do you want to take this as well?
Sure. Thanks, Amit. I think that's a great question. I think I'd like to say that we will have to create a more integrated response to this. We are ultimately seizing this moment, or we should be seizing this moment, to make the adaptation in our management of cities and planning of cities, which has been made at every historic moment when pandemics have affected cities, whether it's London or it's Paris or the creation of hospitals and the whole science of planning. I mean, all of this has come out of responses to these kinds of crises. And I think our response has to be one that begins to create the conditions in a country like India, create the conditions that people can become safer in terms of their own health, along with securing their economic and their social futures as well. So in some fundamental sense, in the Indian context, we have this, serendipitous moment where the restoration of a certain healthy city will also need us to fix some of the other inequalities or constraints or lacks of access for many of our city dwellers. So it's a great moment for the Indian city. And clearly, I think we are likely to be able to look at this adaptation in the context of improving our response to them. Right?
And Wiwi, maybe your final thoughts on that question?
Yeah. Well, it's not a. Basically, when we talk about density, and I may not directly answer that question, but I just want to point out, when we talk about density and we need to answer the question, does it matter? Then I think we need to think of broader ideas that density also influenced by many other things. So we need to keep think in the comprehensive way to see the density related to other issues in multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral thought. So yeah, that's the whole idea that comes up in my mind when listening that difficult questions. Yeah, it's like a challenge to all of us. Thank you.
Francis, do you want to go?
Yes, I think we're getting to the end of this session. We've covered some really interesting concepts. I'll keep the idea of good and bad density, the difference between crowding and density, the difference of the impact of density in formal and informal settlement. I think the conversation could have gone much, much longer. Unfortunately, we are at the end of the time imparted. So I have the responsibility of closing the event. I want to thank our three speakers. I think you were fantastic. Thank you, Wibu. Thank you, Jagan. Thank you, Judy. We changed the format today, and I feel that it worked really well. I thought the conversation was very interesting. It was much more tough for you. You had to think on your feet, but I thought it was very interesting. We also are changing the frequency of our City in the Frontline sessions. The next session will be on September 10. It will be about the issue of aging in cities, and we'll have three speakers from Japan, in fact, talk about the experience around the world, but particularly in Japan. So I want to thank you, Amit, for co-hosting this panel with me. It was great to have you with us. Thank you to the team for preparing and everything, and thank you everyone for attending. Have a great evening or day wherever you are around the world, and see you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.